Welcome to Hearths of Myths. The sea was not merely water. It was a memory of the primordial chaos, a churning, gray expanse that separated the known from the unknown, the mortal from the divine. Before the green hills of Ireland ever felt the press of a god's foot, there was the north. Not the north of directions, not simply a point on a compass, but the north of the world, a metaphysical concept as much as a geographical location. It was here, in the shivering extremities of existence, that Nuada first understood the weight of destiny. He was not yet a king, not yet the silver-handed, but simply Nuada, a prince of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. They were a race of light and beauty, yes, but also of terrible, terrifying proficiency. To understand Nuada, one must first understand the cities that forged him, for a soul is merely a reflection of the fires in which it is tempered. The Tuatha Dé Danann had dwelt for generations in the northern isles of the world, traversing the four great cities of learning, Phalius, Gorius, Murius, and Findius. These were not cities of stone and mortar, built to house merchants and beggars. They were citadels of the mind, fortresses of esoteric wisdom, where the very air shimmered with unwritten spells. Nuada had walked the streets of all four, but it was Findius that claimed his heart. Findius was the city of the south within the north, a paradox of blinding light amidst the eternal twilight. It was presided over by the poet-sage Uiscias, a being so ancient that his beard was said to be woven from the mist of waterfalls. In Findius, the study was not of battle, but of truth, and truth, Nuada learned, was sharper than any spear. Nuada spent his youth in the high towers of Findius, overlooking a sea of clouds that glowed with an inner, opalescent fire. He was tall, even among a race of giants, with hair the color of spun sunlight and eyes that held the unsettling clarity of a winter sky. He was not boisterous like the Dagda, who could consume a river of porridge and laugh until the mountains shook, nor was he dark and brooding like the Morrigan, who spoke to crows and washed armor in blood-red fords. Nuada was possessed of a serene, almost terrifying stillness. He was the calm before the storm, the moment of absolute focus before the arrow is loosed. In the halls of Uiscias, he learned the arts of sovereignty. He learned that a king is not the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who listens to the whispers of the earth. He learned that the land and the king are one. If the king is whole, the land blooms. If the king is blemished, the land rots. It was a lesson that would one day haunt him, a prophecy written in his own flesh, though he did not know it yet. The atmosphere in the northern isles was changing. The Tuatha Dé Danann were restless. They were gods, sorcerers, poets, and craftsmen, but they were exiles. They felt the pull of a home they had never seen, a green island in the west that sang to them in their dreams. Ireland. It was whispered in the corridors of the academy. It was debated in the council chambers. The time for learning was ending. The time for reclaiming was beginning. But to claim a world, one needs power. And so, the four cities offered up their greatest treasures, the four hallows of the Tuatha Dé Danann. From Phalius came the stone of Phal, the Lia Phal, which would scream under the feet of the rightful king. From Gorius came the spear of Lug, the slaughterer, which thirsted for blood so fiercely it had to be kept in a vat of poppy juice to keep it from igniting. From Murius came the cauldron of the Dagda, the Undri, from which no company ever went away unsatisfied. But from Findius, from the city of light where Nuada had studied the architecture of justice, came the sword. It was Nuada who went to receive it. He climbed the highest spire of Uiscias's citadel, a needle of diamond glass that pierced the stratosphere. The air was thin and cold, smelling of ozone and ancient starlight. Uiscias awaited him, holding a bundle wrapped in cloth that seemed woven from shadows. The sage did not speak. Words were unnecessary between masters of the high arts. He simply unraveled the cloth. The light that spilled forth was not the warm glow of a hearth fire, nor the harsh glare of the sun. It was a white, pure, devastating radiance. It was the Claíomh Solais, the sword of light. Nuada reached out. His hand, flesh and blood, strong and unblemished, closed around the hilt. The moment his skin touched the weapon, a shock wave passed through him, a vibration that rattled his teeth and set his marrow humming. The sword was not dead metal. It was alive. It was a shard of the primal will of the universe. It pulsed with a heartbeat that matched his own. He drew it from its sheath, if such a beam of coherence could be said to have a sheath, and the sky above Findius seemed to tear open. The legend said that once drawn, this sword could not be resisted. No shield could stop it, no armor could deflect it. It was the physical manifestation of Nuada's own nature, inevitable, undeniable, and blindingly just. He held the weapon aloft, and for the first time he felt the burden of what was to come. He was no longer just a student of sovereignty. He was the bearer of the light. He was the king-elect. The migration began not with a fleet of ships sailing upon the water, but with a great act of magic that terrified the very elements. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not intend to arrive in Ireland as beggars or refugees. They intended to arrive as gods. Nuada, standing at the prow of the lead vessel, or perhaps floating in the ether, for the texts blur the line between their ships and the clouds, commanded the elements. They wrapped themselves in the Feth Fiada, the magic mist that renders the wearer invisible to mortal eyes. They gathered the dark clouds of the north, sewing them together with incantations of concealment. Imagine the sight from the perspective of the Fir Bolg, the inhabitants of Ireland at that time. They were a sturdy, proud people, warriors and farmers who had tilled the green earth of Éire for generations. They knew the moods of the sea. They knew the patterns of the wind. But they had never seen this. On the first day of May, the festival of Beltane, the sun did not rise. A shadow fell over the western coast of Ireland, a shadow so profound it seemed to suck the color from the grass and the warmth from the stone. The birds fell silent, retreating into the deep canopy of the oak forests. The cattle lowed in fear, huddling together in the fields. The wind died, replaced by a heavy, static pressure that made the hair on one's arms stand up. Nuada led them down. They did not land on the beaches of the coast. They descended directly onto the mountain of Conmaicne Rain in Connacht. It was an invasion from the sky, to ensure there was no retreat, to ensure that every warrior of the Tuatha Dé Danann knew that victory was the only option. Nuada gave a command that would echo through history. He ordered the burning of their ships. This was not a chaotic act of vandalism. It was a ritual sacrifice. The sleek, magical vessels that had carried them through the mists were piled high. Nuada, holding the Sword of Light, ignited the pyre. The flames that rose were not orange or red, but a terrifying blue and violet, fed by the enchantments of the halls. The smoke from this conflagration was the dark clouds spoken of in the myths. It billowed out, thick and oily, blotting out the sun for 3 days and 3 nights. It was a declaration of absolute commitment. By destroying their means of return, Nuada bound his people to the soil of Ireland. They would conquer or they would die. There was no going back to the Northern Isles. The bridge was burned. For the Fir Bolg, the arrival was a nightmare. The smoke cleared, and there, standing on the high ground, entrenched in the fastnesses of the west, was a new army. But this was not an army of leather and rusted iron. This was a host that shone. Even from a distance, the Tuatha Dé Danann glittered. Their armor was filigreed with gold and silver, worked by the smith Goibniu. Their cloaks were dyed in colors unknown to the primitive dyers of the Fir Bolg, crimson that vibrated, azure that looked like a cut piece of the sky, and at their head stood Nuada. He was magnificent and terrible. He wore a silver helm that encased his head in a halo of metal. His cloak was fastened with a brooch of white gold, and at his hip hung the Sword of Light, sheathed now, but vibrating with a low hum that could be felt in the teeth of anyone standing within 50 paces. He did not look like an invader. He looked like a returning owner finding squatters in his hall. His demeanor was not one of rage, but of supreme confidence. This was the quality that unnerved the Fir Bolg more than any weapon. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not scream war cries. They stood in disciplined silence, waiting for the command of their king. Nuada knew that war was inevitable, but he was a student of Uiskias, and he knew that the sword should always be the last resort, even when one possesses the Sword of Light. He sent ambassadors. He sent poets. But the interactions were tense. The Fir Bolg were proud. They had held Ireland against the Fomorians. They had cleared the plains and built the forts. They would not simply hand over their sovereignty to these sky people. The tension built over weeks. Nuada moved his host to the Plain of Towers, Mag Tuired. It was a landscape of jagged limestone and scrub, a hard place for a hard battle. He set up his camp with geometric precision. The tents of the Tuatha Dé Danann were arranged in patterns that mirrored the constellations, channeling the power of the heavens down into the earth. Every night, Nuada walked the perimeter. He listened to the songs of his people, songs of longing for the home they had left and the home they were claiming. He spoke with the Dagda, who was testing the weight of his massive club. He spoke with Ogma, the champion, who was carving Ogham script into a heavy stone, spelling out victory. But Nuada's mind was occupied with the burden of kingship. He looked at his hand, his right hand, strong, dexterous, capable of wielding the ultimate weapon. He flexed the fingers. He watched the tendons move under the skin. He marveled, as one rarely does, at the miracle of the body. How fragile it is, how easily unmade. He had a premonition, a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the wind coming off the Atlantic. He pushed it aside. A king cannot afford fear. He can only afford strategy. The Fir Bolg eventually sent their own champion, Shreng, to parley. The meeting between the two sides was a study in contrasts. The Fir Bolg were heavy, grounded. their weapons massive and blunt, spears like tree trunks, heavy clubs. The Tuatha Dé Danann were light, sharp, their spears thin as needles, but tipped with enchantments. Sreng and Bress, who represented the Tuatha Dé at this stage, though Nuada watched from the ridge, exchanged weapons to inspect them. Sreng marveled at the lightness of the Tuatha Dé spears, while the Tuatha Dé marveled at the crushing weight of the Fir Bolg lances. It was a mutual recognition of lethality. Nuada made an offer. It was a generous offer, born of his philosophy of balance. He offered to divide the island. The Fir Bolg could take one half. The Tuatha Dé Danann would take the other. They could live as neighbors, allies against the darkness of the Fomorians that lurked in the sea. It was a proposal of peace. But the Fir Bolg king, Mag Tuired, refused. He feared that if they gave the Tuatha Dé a foothold, their magic would eventually swallow the whole island. They chose war. They chose total sovereignty, or total annihilation. Nuada received the news with a heavy heart. He stood on the hill of Belgatan, overlooking the plain where the armies would meet. The grass was green, dotted with the yellow of early summer flowers. Soon, he knew, it would be red. He drew the sword of light. The blade flared, casting long shadows even at midday. He turned to his host. He did not give a rousing speech of hatred. He spoke of necessity. He spoke of destiny. He told them that Ireland was the promised land, the emerald jewel, and that it required a price to be paid in blood. The morning of the battle arrived with a mist that clung to the ground, obscuring the feet of the warriors so that they looked like ghosts floating over the earth. The silence was absolute. No birds sang. The wind held its breath. Then the sound of the war horns shattered the morning. The deep, guttural roar of the Fir Bolg horns answered the high, piercing clarion of the Tuatha Dé trumpets. Nuada took his place at the center of the line. He was the fulcrum. To his left was the Dagda, a whirlwind of violence. To his right was Ogma, a wall of muscle. But Nuada was the mind. He directed the flow of the battle not just with shouts, but with the movements of the Sword of Light. When he raised it, the Tuatha Dé surged forward like a tide. When he lowered it, they held the line like a cliff face. The clash was titanic. It was not merely steel against iron. It was magic against stubbornness. The Tuatha Dé Danann used their arts. They cast illusions of multiple armies to confuse the Fir Bolg. They turned the sods of earth into warriors. But the Fir Bolg were resilient. They had a magic of their own, the magic of the land itself. They stood their ground, hacking at the shimmering shields of the gods, dragging the beautiful, ethereal invaders down into the mud. Nuada fought with a grace that was terrifying to behold. He moved through the chaos like a dancer. The Sword of Light was a blur of white fire. It shore through Fir Bolg shields as if they were made of paper. It cut through bronze armor, through leather, through bone. Every swing was a kill. He did not hack, he flowed. He was water, he was light, he was death. He cut a path through the ranks of the Fir Bolg, seeking their king, seeking to end the conflict with a single decisive stroke. But the battle was not a skirmish. It was a grinder. It lasted for days. Each night, the physicians of the Tuatha Dé, led by Dian Checht, would heal the wounded in the Well of Slain, throwing herbs and incantations into the water so that the dead warriors would rise again the next morning, whole and ready to fight. This horrified the Fir Bolg, who had no such magic. They were fighting an enemy that would not stay dead. Yet, despite this advantage, the numbers of the Fir Bolg were vast, and their ferocity was unmatched. They pressed the center. They pushed back against the brilliance of Nuada, and it was in this crucible of noise and blood that the defining moment of Nuada's life occurred. He found himself isolated. The ebb and flow of the melee had separated him from his bodyguards. He was alone in a circle of Fir Bolg warriors, led by their champion, Shreng. Shreng was a monster of a man, not in evil, but in sheer physical scale. He wielded a heavy iron mace and a broad shield of black oak reinforced with iron bands. He saw the king of the gods. He saw the sword of light, and he did not back down. He roared a challenge that shook the stones of the plain. Nuada turned to meet him. The duel was legendary. It was the irresistible force against the immovable object. Nuada was faster, his sword flashing like lightning, scoring hit after hit on Shreng's armor. But Shreng was tough. He absorbed the blows, grunting with pain, but refusing to fall. He swung his heavy mace, forcing Nuada to dodge, to weave, to dance away from the bone-crushing impacts. The dust rose around them, creating a private arena within the greater battle. The sounds of the other warriors faded into a dull roar. For Nuada, the world narrowed down to the tip of Shreng's weapon and the rhythm of his own breathing. He saw an opening. Shreng had overextended a swing. Nuada lunged, the sword of light aiming for the gap in the Fir Bolg's neck armor. It was a trap, or perhaps just the brutal luck of war. Shreng had anticipated the speed of the god. He twisted his body, taking the blow on his shoulder plate, a blow that shattered the iron but did not kill him, and simultaneously lashed out with his own sword, a heavy, jagged piece of iron that he had drawn when his mace became too slow. The blow was not aimed at Nuada's head. It was aimed at his arm, the arm that held the sovereignty of Ireland, the arm that held the sword of light. Nuada saw it coming. Time seemed to slow down. He tried to pull back. He tried to raise his guard, but the momentum of his own attack had committed him. The heavy iron blade of the Fir Bolg champion caught Nuada's right arm just below the shoulder. There was no pain at first, just a numb, jarring impact, like being hit by a falling tree. Nuada stumbled back. He looked down. He expected to see a wound. He expected to see blood. What he saw was the grass, and lying in the grass, still clutching the hilt of the sword of light, was his arm. The shock was absolute. The king of the gods, the perfect being, had been unmade. The blood came then, a torrent of divine vitality spilling onto the soil of Mag Tuired. Nuada fell to his knees. The world went gray. The roar of Shreng, triumphant and terrible, washed over him. Shreng raised his weapon for the killing blow. The king was down. The invasion was over. But the Tuatha Dé Danann were not so easily broken. The Dagda, seeing his king fall, roared with a sound that cracked the sky. He charged through the Fir Bolg lines, his massive club sweeping men aside like dolls. He stood over the fallen Nuada, a tower of protective rage. He beat back Shreng. He beat back the Fir Bolg circle. He scooped up the broken king in his arms, shielding him with his own massive body. The battle raged on, but for Nuada, the war was over. He was carried from the field, drifting in and out of consciousness. He felt the cold hands of the healers. He heard the weeping of the women. But mostly, he felt the absence, the terrible, screaming lightness on his right side, the void where his power had been. When he awoke, days later, the battle had been won. The Tuatha Dé Danann had pushed the Fir Bolg back to the sea. They had offered them the province of Connaught as a peace settlement, and the Fir Bolg, decimated and awed, had accepted. The Tuatha Dé Danann were the masters of Ireland. They had won the island. But Nuada had lost everything. He sat in his tent, wrapped in bandages that smelled of bitter herbs. The stump of his arm was healing, the flesh knitting together under the magic of Dian Checht. But the damage went deeper than the bone. In the society of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the king was the avatar of perfection. No blemished man may be king. It was the oldest law. It was the geese that held their society together. A king with a missing hand could not hold the sword of justice. He could not perform the rituals of wholeness. He was a symbol of brokenness. Nuada looked at the empty space where his arm had been. He thought of the sword of light, now lying on a table across the room, a weapon he could no longer wield. He realized with a crushing clarity that his victory was his defeat. He had led his people to the promised land, but he could not enter it with them as their leader. He was the conqueror, but he was also the casualty. The nobles came to him. They were respectful, their eyes filled with pity that burned Nuada more than Shreng's sword ever could. They spoke softly. They praised his leadership. They praised his sacrifice. But the unspoken sentence hung in the air like smoke. You must step down. Nuada did not wait for them to say it. He possessed a dignity that transcended his physical injury. He stood up, unsteady, pale but upright. He convened the council. He looked at the faces of his people, the Dagda, Ogma, Goibnu, and the ambitious, beautiful Bress who stood in the back, watching with glittering eyes. The land is yours, Nuada said, his voice quiet but firm. I have brought you here. I have paid the price of admission. But the law is the law. I am no longer whole. I am no longer king. Was an act of supreme humility, and was an act of supreme humility, an abdication that hurt more than the amputation. He walked out of the tent, out of the circle of power, and into the shadows of the new world he had won, but could not rule. Nuada, the prince of Findius, was simply Nuada. The prince of Findius was simply Nuada the maimed. The king was dead. Long live the king. But who would replace him? And what darkness would descend upon Ireland now that the Lightbringer was broken? The era of the Silver Hand had not yet begun. First, there had to be the era of the Iron Stump. The silence that follows a great battle is not a peace, it is a vacuum. The plain of towers, Mag Tuired, which had rung with the clangor of bronze and the shrieks of dying demigods, was now possessed by the wind and the crows. The Tuatha Dé Danann had won, yes. They stood as the masters of the field, their banners snapping in the salt-heavy air, but the victory tasted of ash. The cost was too high. The cost was the king. Nuada sat in his pavilion, the flaps tied back to reveal the gray horizon. The pain in his severed limb had dulled to a throbbing ache, a persistent drumbeat that reminded him with every pulse that he was less than he had been. But the physical pain was trivial compared to the phantom sensation of the missing hand. He could still feel the fingers of his right hand, the ghost fingers, clenched around the hilt of a sword that was no longer there. He could feel the weight of the sovereignty he had forfeited. It was a cruel trick of the mind, a neurological refusal to accept the reality of the blemish. Outside, the business of the aftermath began. The Fir Bolg, defeated but unbroken, had retreated to the edge of the province. Shreng, their champion, the man who had maimed a god, still lived. It was a testament to the strange chivalry of this ancient war that the Tuatha Dé Danann did not pursue them to extinction. Instead, they offered a treaty. It was Nuada's last act as the de facto leader before his formal abdication. He ordered that the Fir Bolg be given the province of Connacht, the rugged, stone-walled west, where they could live according to their own laws, a people of the sunset. It was an act of mercy, but also of strategy. A cornered enemy fights to the death, but a defeated enemy given land becomes a buffer. But with the borders drawn, the Tuatha Dé Danann turned their eyes inward. A crisis of succession loomed like a thunderhead. The law was absolute. Ni tualaing rige fer ko en anim. No man with a blemish shall be king. It was not merely a rule of aesthetics. It was a metaphysical imperative. The king was the external soul of the land. If the king was maimed, the harvest would be maimed. If the king was incomplete, the seasons would fracture. Nuada knew this better than anyone. He had studied in the shining towers of Findius. He knew the geometry of power. He stepped aside not out of weakness, but out of a terrifying, self-sacrificing strength. The great council gathered at Tara. The mood was somber. The Dagda was there, his massive frame hunched, his club resting by his side like a sleeping beast. Ogma Sunface was there, his golden skin marred by the grime of war. Dian Checht, the physician, was there, his eyes already calculating, looking at Nuada's stump with a mixture of professional curiosity and professional jealousy. And Bress was there. Bress, Eletha's son. Bress the Beautiful. He stood apart from the war-weary veterans. He was pristine. His armor was unblemished, his face possessing a symmetry that was almost painful to look at. He was the son of a Tuatha Dé Danann woman, Eriu, but his father was Eletha, a king of the Fomorians. This dual heritage, which should have been a warning, was instead seen as a glittering opportunity. The Tuatha Dé Danann were tired of war. They looked at the dark sea, where the Fomorian raiders lurked, and they felt fear. They reasoned that if they chose Bress, the kinsman of the Fomorians, as their king, they would secure a lasting peace. They would unite the light and the dark. It was a seductive logic. It was the logic of exhaustion. Nuada watched the debate from the shadows of his abdication. He saw the way the nobles looked at Bress, with hunger, with desire. They wanted his beauty to mask their own scars. They wanted his Fomorian blood to shield them from Fomorian aggression. Nuada did not speak against him. How could he? He was the broken one. His voice carried the weight of failure. And so the decision was made. The sovereignty of Ireland, won by Nuada's blood, was handed to Brez. The coronation was a spectacle of light, but the shadow was already lengthening. Brez ascended the Lia File, the stone of destiny. The stone screamed under his feet, as it must for a rightful king, but those with sharp ears, the poets, the satirists, heard a dissonance in the cry, a crack in the voice of the earth. Brez took the white wand of kingship. He did not look at Nuada. He looked only at the reflection of his own glory in the eyes of his subjects. The reign of Brez began with a promise of gold and ended in the reality of iron. For the first few months, the Tuatha Dé Danann reveled in the peace. The Fomorian ships did not raid the coasts. Instead, they came as guests, their dark hulls docking in the harbors of the east. But the guests did not leave. They brought with them a heaviness, a cold damp that seeped into the bones of the land. Brez revealed his true nature slowly, like a slow-acting poison. He was not a king of the people. He was a king of the tribute. He did not understand the concept of neen, the reciprocal generosity that binds a Celtic society together. In the old ways, a king was a river of wealth. He received tribute only to distribute it again in feasts, in gifts to poets, in support for the weak. But Brez was a dam. He hoarded. He collected. He built a great palace for himself, not with magic, but with the sweat of gods. And here, the tragedy of the Tuatha Dé Danann truly began. The heroes who had stormed the heavens, the warriors who had defeated the Fir Bolg, were reduced to laborers. It was a humiliation designed to break their spirits. Ogma, the champion, whose eloquence could bind men's minds and whose strength could topple oaks, was forced to carry firewood. Every day, the sun-faced god trudged from the forests of the Boyne Valley to the fortress of Brez, carrying bundles of wet faggots on his back. The rough wood chafed his golden skin. The sap stained his hands. He, who had invented the Ogham script, was reduced to a beast of burden. He did not complain. He bore the weight with a terrible, silent dignity. But the fire in his eyes began to dim. The Dagda, the All-Father, the Lord of great knowledge, was given a shovel. Brez commanded him to dig the trenches and earthworks of the new fort at Rath Brez. The Dagda, whose club could kill 9 men with one swing and resurrect them with the other, stood knee-deep in the mud of Ireland. He dug. He heaved the wet clay. The Fomorian overseers mocked him. They called him an old fool. They laughed at his tunic, which was short and brown, stained with the earth he loved too much to abandon. The Dagda endured it. He dug the trenches deep and wide, channeling his rage into the soil, whispering secrets to the worms and the roots. He was biding his time. The former king had retreated to a small holding in the west, away from the court of Brez. He lived in a simple dun overlooking the ocean. He was not forced to carry wood or dig trenches. Even Brez dared not humiliate the former king so openly. But his punishment was isolation. He was the forgotten one. He spent his days walking the cliffs, the wind whipping his cloak around his one good arm. He felt the suffering of his people through the land itself. When Ogma's back bled, Nuada felt a sting on his own skin. When the Dagda groaned under the weight of the shovel, Nuada's breath hitched. The link between the true king and the land had not been severed by the sword of Shreng. It had only been suppressed. Bress was the king on the chair, but Nuada was still the king in the blood. The oppression worsened. The Fomorians, emboldened by their kinsman's rule, began to levy a tax on Ireland. It was not a tax of gold, but a tax of life. They demanded 2/3 of the milk, 2/3 of the corn, and 2/3 of the children. It was a return to the dark days of the prehistory, the days of blood sacrifice. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods of light and art, were being ground down into dust. They had traded their sovereignty for safety, and they had received neither. The breaking point came not with a sword, but with a word. It came in the form of Credne, the son of Ogma, a poet of the high grade. He came to visit Bress at his fortress. In the ancient laws of Ireland, a poet was a sacred guest. He was to be fed the best meat, given the best bed, and entertained with the finest wine. To insult a poet was to insult the very fabric of truth. Credne arrived at Rathbress, weary from the road. He expected a welcome befitting his station. Instead, he was shown to a small, dark hut where the wind whistled through the chinks in the stone. There was no fire in the hearth. There were no furs on the bed. When dinner came, it was not roast boar or salmon. It was 3 small, dry cakes of bread placed on a bare wooden table. Credne looked at the dry bread. He looked at the cold room. He realized then that Bress was not merely a bad king. He was an anti-king. He was a creature who negated the very essence of life. He did not give. He withheld. He did not warm. He froze. The poet stood up. He did not eat the bread. He walked out of the hut into the courtyard where the nobles were gathering. He stood before the king's hall and spoke. He did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. He simply recited. Without food for the table, without cow's milk for the calf, without a man's lodging after darkness, without paying a company of storytellers. Let that be the condition of Bress. It was the first satire ever made in Ireland. It was a glam diken, a satire of destruction. The words were not just insults. They were a curse. They were a magical formula that stripped the legitimacy from the king. When Credne spoke the words, blotches appeared on Bress's face. Red boils of shame erupted on his perfect skin. The beauty that had seduced the Tuatha Dé Danann was marred. The mask had slipped. The satire spread through the land like a wildfire. It was whispered in the trenches where the Dagda dug. It was sung in the forests where Ogma gathered wood. It reached the cliffs of the west, where Nuada walked alone. Nuada heard the words of the satire carried on the wind. Without food, without lodging, he stopped walking. He looked at his hand, the stump that had healed into a smooth white dome of scar tissue. For months, he had accepted his fate. He had accepted that he was broken, and therefore useless. He had believed the lie that wholeness is purely physical. But Bress was physically whole. Bress had 2 hands, 2 eyes, 2 legs, and yet Bress was the blemished one. Bress was blemished in his soul. He was a miser, a tyrant, a coward. Nuada realized then that the definition of kingship he had accepted was flawed. True wholeness was not about the number of fingers on a hand. It was about the capacity to give, to protect, to serve. Nuada returned to his dun. He called for his servants. He did not put on his armor. He could not fasten the straps with one hand. But he put on his cloak of authority. He sent a message, not to the warriors, but to the healers. He sent for Dian-Cecht, the great physician. But he also sent for someone else. He sent for Credne, the brazier, the worker of bronze and silver. Arrived at the secret meeting place of the Tuatha Dé Danann resistance, a hidden valley in the Boyne, away from the spies of the Fomorians. There he found his people broken, starving, and humiliated. When Ogma saw Nuada, he dropped his bundle of wood. The great champion fell to his knees, weeping. The Dagda climbed out of his trench, covered in mud, and embraced his old friend with a ferocity that cracked ribs. They saw in Nuada not a cripple, but a memory of what they used to be. They saw the light. But Nuada knew that memory was not enough. To challenge Bress, to challenge the Fomorians, he needed to be king again, and to be king, he needed a hand. He sat with Dian-Cecht and Credne by the fire. The physician examined the stump. "The flesh is healed," Dian-Cecht said, his voice rough. "I can do no more. I cannot grow a limb from nothing. That is the province of the Creator, not the physician." Nuada turned to Credne. The smith was silent, looking into the fire. Credne was an artist of metal. He knew the soul of silver. He knew that silver was the metal of the moon, of fluids, of healing, of purity. "If the flesh fails," Nuada said softly, "then let the artifice prevail. I do not ask for flesh, Dian-Cecht. I ask for function. I ask for a symbol that can hold a sword, with wires of white gold. I can channel with wires of white gold. I can channel the nerves into the metal, so that you will feel the cold of the hilt and the heat of the fire. It will be a masterpiece. But it will be cold, Nuada. It will always be cold." "I have been cold for a long time," Nuada replied. "Make it." And so, while Bress sat in his high tower, counting his stolen grain and nursing the boils on his face, the fires were lit in the forge of Credne. The hammer began to ring. It was a different sound than the hammers of war. It was a rhythmic, precise tapping. It was the sound of reconstruction. Dian-Cecht prepared the stump. He used potions to soften the scar tissue, to expose the nerve endings without pain. It was a gruesome, delicate surgery. Nuada sat through it without flinching, his eyes fixed on the horizon, imagining the feel of the sword of light in a hand that did not yet exist. This was the interregnum, the pause between the breaths of history. The Tuatha Dé Danann were holding their breath. They were waiting for the miracle. They were waiting for the silver to flow. They did not know yet that the silver hand would be only the beginning of the healing, that a greater restoration was to come, one that would challenge the jealousy of Dian-Cecht himself. But for now, in the darkness of the oppression, the spark of hope was a piece of metal, slowly taking the shape of a palm, a thumb, and fingers. The silver hand was being born, and with it, the second rise of Nuada. The king of the iron stump was dying. The king of the silver hand was awakening. The silence of the hearth was about to be broken by the roar of the furnace. The forge of Credne was not a place of fire and soot like the smithies of mortal men. It was a sanctuary of transmutation. Hidden deep within the wooded valleys of the Boyne, far from the prying eyes of Bress's Fomorian tax collectors, the air here vibrated with a high-pitched, crystalline hum. It smelled of ozone, crushed quartz, and the metallic tang of blood. Nuada sat in the center of the workshop, stripped to the waist, his mutilated arm resting on a slab of black basalt. He was the canvas upon which the salvation of the Tuatha Dé Danann would be painted. Credne, the brazier, moved with the erratic, jerky energy of a man possessed by his art. He did not work with iron, which is the metal of war and earth. He worked with silver, the metal of the moon, of tides, and of reflection. Silver is the mirror of the soul, and Credne intended to forge a mirror that could hold a sword. He melted the ingots in a crucible of white clay, singing to the metal as it liquefied. The song was not in a language Nuada understood. It was the language of the metal itself, a coaxing, whispering cadence that convinced the silver to flow like water and harden like diamond. Opposite him stood Dian Cecht, the great physician. His presence was heavier, darker. He was a man of immense power and immense pride, his beard gray with the dust of grave mold and dried herbs. He looked at Nuada's stump, not with pity, but with a critical, almost architectural eye. He had prepared the flesh. He had cauterized the nerve endings with potions that numbed the pain, but kept the spirit channels open. He was the architect of the bridge between the god's body and the artisan's creation. The bond must be absolute, Dian Cecht muttered, grinding a paste of mistletoe and red ochre in a mortar. If the silver rejects the flesh, the arm will rot. If the flesh rejects the silver, the metal will burn you like ice. You must open your mind, Nuada. You must welcome the cold. Nuada closed his eyes. He focused on the void where his hand used to be. He remembered the grip of the sword of light. He remembered the texture of Sif's hair. He remembered the rough bark of the oak trees. He summoned the ghost of his hand and offered it to the metal. Credne brought the mold. It was a masterpiece of ceramic casting, shaped from the hand of Nuada's own son to ensure the proportions were dynastic. He poured the molten silver. The hiss of the metal filled the cave. The light was blinding. As the silver cooled, Credne began the true work. He took fine filaments of white gold and threaded them through the wrist of the silver hand, connecting them to the nerves in Nuada's stump. He felt the silver wires burrowing into his body. He felt the silver wires burrowing into his flesh, seeking purchase in the bone. He gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down his face, but he did not cry out. A king does not scream. A king endures. When it was done, Nuada looked down. Where there had been nothing, there was now a gleaming, articulated hand of pure silver. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Every joint was perfect. Every fingernail was a polished crescent of electrum. "Move it," Credne whispered, wiping soot from his brow. Nuada concentrated. He sent a command from his brain to a limb that was no longer biology, but metallurgy. He watched, fascinated and horrified, as the silver fingers twitched. They curled into a fist. The metal made a soft, musical clinking sound, like coins falling into a purse. He opened the hand. He reached out and picked up a goblet of water. The grip was precise, unyielding. He was whole, or so it seemed. But as the days turned into weeks, Nuada realized the truth of Credne's warning. The hand was cold. It had no warmth of life. When he touched his face, it felt like a statue caressing him. When he drew his sword, which he could do now with a terrifying speed, the vibration of the blade did not travel up his arm in the same way. The connection was dampened. He was powerful, yes. He was Nuada Airgetlám, Nuada of the Silver Hand. He became a symbol of resistance, a shining beacon that rallied the oppressed Tuatha Dé. But he was not a living king. He was a cyborg of the Bronze Age, a construct of magic and metal. The people loved him. They saw the silver hand as a sign of divine favor. They whispered that Nuada was stronger now, that he was harder, more like the weapons they needed to defeat the Fomorians. But Nuada felt the hollowness. The blemish that had cost him the throne was gone in the eyes of the law. He had a hand, after all, but the blemish in his soul remained. He was separated from the world by a barrier of silver. He could not feel the pulse of the earth through his fingers. It was into this atmosphere of cold restoration that the true miracle arrived. It came not from the high councils of the wise, but from the younger generation. It came in the form of Miach. Miach was the son of Dian Cecht. He was young, with eyes that held a kindness his fathers lacked. While Dian Cecht was a surgeon of the knife and the cauterizing iron, Miach was a healer of the growth and the flow. He studied the moss, the mycelium, the way a lizard regrows its tail. He understood that life wants to be whole, and that magic is merely the art of removing the obstacles to that wholeness. He came to Nuada's dun one evening, accompanied by his sister, Eirmed. Eirmed was the keeper of the herbs, a woman who knew the secret names of every plant in Ireland. They found Nuada sitting by the fire, polishing the silver hand with a soft cloth. The metal gleamed in the firelight, a stark contrast to the weary flesh of the god's face. "It is a fine piece of work," Miach said softly, stepping into the light. "Credne is a master, but it is not you, Nuada." Nuada looked up, his eyes narrowing. "It serves. It holds the sword. It strikes the enemy. What more does a king need?" "A king needs to feel," Miach replied. "A king needs to bleed. Metal does not bleed. Metal does not heal. If you are cut, you can be mended, but you cannot grow." Dian Cecht, who was attending Nuada, bristled. "Watch your tongue, boy. I prepared the stump. I oversaw the attachment. It is the greatest work of healing ever performed in Ireland. Do not insult the art with your childish notions." Miach did not look at his father. He looked only at Nuada. "I can give you your flesh back, my lord. I can grow the hand of bone and blood. I can make you whole, not just restored." The silence in the room was heavy. Nuada looked at the silver hand. He flexed the metal fingers. To feel again. To touch the world without the barrier. It was a hope he had buried deep beneath the silver. "How?" Nuada asked. "The old hand," Miach said. "The hand that was cut. Do you have it?" "It was buried," Nuada said. on the field of Mag Tuired. Streng's champion buried it as a trophy. We must find it, Miach said. Or, if it is returned to the earth, we must use the memory of it that lives in the soil. The texts tell us that they retrieved the desiccated remains, or perhaps they used the sympathetic magic of the earth where the blood had spilled. Miach took the withered, skeletal hand. He did not use fire. He did not use knives. He placed the dead hand against Nuada's silver wrist. He placed his own hands over them, and he began to chant. It was a chant of binding, but not of metal. It was the old healing. Bone to bone, vein to vein, sinew to sinew, blood to blood, flesh to flesh, skin to skin. For 3 days and 3 nights, Miach sang. He did not sleep. He did not eat. Eärmed sat beside him, spreading a cloak of green rushes over the arm, feeding the spell with the vitality of the earth. The unchecked watched from the shadows, his face a mask of darkening thunder. He saw what was happening, and he could not believe it. He saw the silver loosen. He saw the dead bone whiten and knit. He saw the red flush of blood return to the withered capillaries. On the 3rd morning, Miach stopped. He slumped back, exhausted. He removed the cloak of rushes. The silver hand lay on the floor, empty and cold. And on Nuada's arm, pink and raw but undeniably alive, was a hand of flesh. Nuada stared. He trembled. He lifted the hand. He flexed the fingers. They moved with the fluid grace of biology, not the mechanical precision of gears. He reached out and touched the face of Eärmed. He felt the warmth of her skin. He felt the texture of her hair. Tears, unbidden and shocking, streamed down the god's face. "I am whole," Nuada whispered. "I am whole." He stood up and embraced Miach. "You have done the impossible. You have surpassed the gods. You have given me back my soul." The joy in the dun was explosive. The news spread like wildfire. Nuada Airgetlám was no more. Nuada the Perfect had returned. The blemish was gone. The legal barrier to his kingship was obliterated. Bress could no longer claim to be the only whole king. The path to the throne was open, but in the shadows, the darkness gathered. The unchecked stood alone. He looked at the silver hand lying discarded on the floor, the hand he had helped create, the hand that was his masterpiece. He looked at his son, who was now being hailed as the greatest healer in the world. Jealousy is a cold poison. It does not burn like rage. It freezes like ice. The unchecked was the god of medicine. He was the supreme physician. No one was supposed to be better than him, especially not his own son. The success of Miach was not a triumph for the clan. It was an insult to the father. "Miach," the unchecked said, his voice deceptively calm. "Come with me. Let us examine the hand. Let us ensure the nerves are truly knit." Miach, trusting and exhausted, followed his father out of the dun, into the quiet of the forest clearing. He thought his father wanted to learn the secret of the spell. The unchecked drew his sword. It was not a weapon of war, but a long, thin blade used for amputation. "You have tampered with the natural order," the unchecked said, his eyes empty of love. "You have regrown what should be dead. you have shamed the art." He struck. The first blow sliced through the skin of Miach's head. It was a precise, surgical cut. Miach, surprised but still a master healer, simply spoke a word, and the skin knit back together instantly. "Father," he pleaded. "Why?" Dian checked, struck again. The second blow cut through the flesh, down to the bone. Again, Miach healed it. The flesh closed. The wound vanished. Dian checked, struck a third time. The blade cracked the skull, exposing the membrane of the brain. Miach staggered. His power was waning, but he healed even this. The bone fused. Then Dian checked, realizing that his son's power was indeed greater than his own, struck the fourth blow. This time, he did not aim to wound. He aimed to erase. He drove the sword into the brain, cutting the connection between the mind and the magic. He severed the soul. Miach fell. He did not rise. The greatest healer of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the man who had restored the king, lay dead in the grass, slain by the father of healing. Dian checked, stood over the body. He was panting. He looked at his bloody sword. "No one," he whispered, "no one heals past the stroke of the brain." He buried his son there in the clearing. He piled stones over the body and returned to the dun, telling Nuada that Miach had gone on a journey, or that the effort of the spell had consumed him. But the earth knew, the land knew, and Airmed knew. She went to the grave of her brother. She wept not just tears, but power. And from the grave of Miach, responding to the magic in his decomposing body, herbs began to grow. 365 herbs grew from the grave, one for every joint and sinew and organ of the human body. Each herb was a cure for the specific part of the body from which it grew. Airmed gathered them. She spread her cloak on the ground and began to sort them. This was the catalogue of immortality. This was the cure for all sickness, the secret that would make the Tuatha Dé Danann truly invincible. If she could organize them, death would be a memory. But Dian checked came. He saw what she was doing. He saw that even in death, his son was surpassing him. In a fit of petty, terrifying rage, he overturned the cloak. He mixed the herbs. He scattered them to the four winds. "Let them remain a mystery," he roared. "If men want to heal, they must come to me. They must not pluck immortality from the grass." And so the knowledge was lost. To this day, healers know the properties of some herbs, but the unified theory of healing, the map of the body that Miach wrote in the soil, is gone. Nuada sat in his hall, rubbing his new living hand. He felt the warmth. He felt the blood. But as he looked at the empty seat where Miach should have been, he felt a chill that no silver could produce. He was whole again. He was ready to reclaim the throne. He was ready to challenge Brez. But the cost had been the life of the only one who could truly fix the broken. The king was back. The silver hand was cast aside, destined to become a relic, a name, a legend that would outlive the flesh. Nuada Airgetlám was dead. Nuada the king had returned. And his first act would be to take the sword, not the scalpel, and turn it towards the false king Brez. The time of healing was over. The time of purging had begun. The restoration of a king is rarely as simple as the mending of a limb. While Nuada's flesh had knit together under the forbidden magic of Miach, the realm of Ireland remained fractured. Bress the Beautiful, now revealed as Bress the Tyrant, sat in his fortress like a spider in a web that had been torn by the wind. The satire of Credne had done its work. The boils on Bress's face were the external manifestation of his internal rot. The Tuatha Dé Danann, emboldened by the return of their true leader, began to turn their backs on the false king. They stopped bringing tribute. They stopped bowing. They looked to the west, where Nuada stood whole once more. Bress, realizing his power was dissolving like mist in the morning sun, did not fight. He was a creature of entitlement, not of struggle. He fled. He took his wife, Bridget, and his few loyal followers, and he went to the coast. He looked out at the dark, churning sea, towards the chaotic realm of his father's people. He went to the Fomorians. He went to demand an army to reclaim what he believed was his property. With the tyrant gone, Nuada returned to Tara. The hill of kingship, which had grown cold and silent under Bress, burst into life. The fires were lit in the great banqueting hall, the Tech Mid-Chuarta. The poets, who had been silenced or forced to recite doggerel for scraps, tuned their harps. The warriors, who had been digging ditches, polished their spears. Nuada ascended the throne. He sat on the high seat, the Leophile beneath his feet. The stone roared. It was a sound of deep tectonic recognition. The land knew him. The land welcomed him back. But Nuada did not smile. He sat with the heavy brow of a man who knows that the storm has not passed, but merely paused to draw breath. He looked at his hand, the hand of flesh that Miach had died to give him, and he wondered if it would be strong enough to hold back the tide that Bress was surely summoning from the deep. He was the king, yes. He was the silver hand, now made whole. But he was also tired. He had fought the Fir Bolg. He had lost a limb. He had endured exile. He had seen the best of his healers murdered by his own father. He possessed wisdom, the hard-won wisdom of suffering. But wisdom alone does not stop an army of giants. It was Samhain, the great feast of the turning of the year, when the veil between the worlds is thinnest. The Tuatha Dé Danann were gathered at Tara for the feast. The hall was filled with the smoke of roasting boar and the scent of mead. But the laughter was brittle. The shadow of the Fomorians hung over the feast. Everyone knew that Bress would return, and he would not come alone. He would come with Balor of the Evil Eye. He would come with Indech, the son of the goddess of the deep. He would come to wipe the Tuatha Dé Danann from the face of the earth. Nuada sat at the head of the table, flanked by the Dagda and Ogma. They spoke in low voices of strategy, of fortifications, of alliances. But they knew in their hearts that they were outmatched. The Fomorians were the primal powers of chaos. The Tuatha Dé were the gods of art and civilization. Art is beautiful, but chaos is relentless. And then a horn blew at the outer ramparts. It was not a war horn. It was a challenge, a clear, high note that cut through the murmur of the feast like a ray of sunlight piercing a dark room. The doorkeeper of Tara, a warrior named Gamal, went to the gate. He looked out into the night. Standing there, alone on the causeway, was a young warrior. He was dressed in the outfit of a king, yet he wore the cloak of a traveler. He carried 2 spears, but he held them lightly, as if they were reeds. His face was radiant, glowing with an inner light that reminded Gamal of the sun breaking through the clouds. "Who is there?" Gamal called out, following the ancient protocol of the fortress. "No one enters Tara at the feast of Samhain unless they possess an art." The stranger smiled. It was a smile of terrifying confidence. "Here is Lug Lamfada," he replied. "Lug of the long arm. I am the son of Cian of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and my mother is Ethnu, the daughter of Balor. I am the bridge between the light and the dark. I have come to serve the king." Gamal was unimpressed by lineage. In the meritocracy of the gods, blood mattered less than skill. "We have plenty of warriors," Gamal said. "What art do you practice? For no one enters here without an art." "Question me," Lug said. "I am a carpenter." Gamal shook his head. "We do not need a carpenter. We have Lukta, the son of Luachid. He is a master of the axe and the adze. He can shape a spear shaft from a living tree without waking the birds nesting in its branches. We have no need of you." Lug did not blink. "Question me again. I am a smith." "We have a smith," Gamal retorted. "We have Colum Quayenach of the 3 new techniques. He can forge iron that floats on water. He has shod the horses of the sea. We do not need you." "I am a champion," Lug said, leaning on his spear. "We have a champion," Gamal said, gesturing back towards the hall where Ogma sat. "We have Ogma Sunface. He can lift a stone that 20 oxen cannot move. He is the strongest of the strong. We do not need you." "I am a harper," Lug said. "We have a harper," Gamal replied, getting impatient. "We have Abhian, the son of Betelmos. When he plays the sleep strain, the very mountains slumber. When he plays the sorrow strain, the stones weep. We do not need you." "I am a poet and a historian," Lug continued, his voice calm, rhythmic, like the recitation of a spell. "We have a poet," Gamal said. "We have Credne. He knows the history of every king who has ever sat on the Leah file. He knows the genealogies of the stars. We do not need you." "I am a sorcerer," Lug said. "We have sorcerers," Gamal sighed. "We have the great druids of the Tuatha Dé. They can turn the day into night and the night into fire. We do not need you." "I am a physician," Lug said. "We have Dian checked," Gamal said, crossing his arms. "Even though he is harsh, his skill is unmatched. He has cured the plague of the crimson wind. We do not need you." "I am a cupbearer," Lug said. "We have 9 cupbearers," Gamal said. "Delt, Drucht, and Daitha among them. They pour the mead without spilling a drop, even in an earthquake. We do not need you." "I am a brazier," Lug said. "We have Credne," Gamal shouted, "the man who made the silver hand. We have no need of you, stranger. Go back to the road." Lug paused. He looked at the gatekeeper with eyes that held the wisdom of the ages and the energy of youth. He did not grow angry. He simply played his final card. "Go to the king," Lug said softly. "Ask him this. Does he have one man who possesses all these arts? If he does, then I will not enter. But if he has a carpenter, and a smith, and a champion, and a harper, and a poet, and a sorcerer, and a physician, and a brazier, and a cupbearer, but does not have one man who is master of them all, then he needs me. I am the Samildanach, the summer of many arts. I am the master of all. Gamal stared at him. The logic was flawless. The audacity was breathtaking. He turned and ran to the hall. He burst into the presence of Nuada. "My lord," Gamal gasped, "a man has come to the door. A warrior unlike any I have ever seen. He claims to be the Samildanach. He claims to practice every art that we hold sacred. He is the smith and the harper, the poet and the fighter. He is the all-craftsman." Nuada sat up straighter. The weariness seemed to fall from his shoulders. He looked at the empty spaces in his court, the spaces where specialists stood, isolated in their own excellence. He realized what was missing. They had specialization, but they lacked synthesis. They lacked the one who could weave the strands together. "Let him in," Nuada commanded. "But first, test him. Take out the Fidchel board." The servants brought the board. It was a sacred game, played on a grid of silver and gold squares, representing the cosmic order of the universe. It was a game of pure intellect, where kings tested their ability to see the future. Lugh entered the hall. He did not bow. He walked to the board. He sat down opposite the best player of the court. He moved the pieces with a speed that blurred the eye. He did not just play. He composed a symphony of strategy. He trapped his opponent's king not with brute force, but with elegant, unavoidable logic. He won the game. He won it so decisively that the configuration of the pieces on the board became known as Lugh's enclosure. Nuada watched the game. He saw the mind behind the moves. He saw a strategic brilliance that far outstripped his own. Nuada was a king of justice, a king of balance. But Lugh was a king of victory. Nuada stood up. The hall fell silent. The silver hand, now flesh, rested on the hilt of his sword. He looked at the young, radiant god. He saw the prophecy of his own obsolescence, and he welcomed it. This is the defining moment of Nuada's character. A lesser king would have been jealous. A lesser king would have seen Lugh as a threat, a usurper who would steal his glory just as he had regained it. But Nuada was the selfless king. He understood that his role was not to rule forever, but to steward the people until the true savior arrived. "Sit in the sage's seat," Nuada said, pointing to the throne. "Go to the high seat, Lugh Samildanach. I yield the floor to you." A gasp went through the hall. The king was stepping down again? "For 13 days, Nuada announced, his voice ringing clear. "I give the sovereignty of Tara to this man. He shall lead us. He shall plan the defense of Ireland. He shall be the mind that directs the hand." Nuada stepped down. Lugh stepped up. The transformation of the court was instant. Lugh did not sit idly. He began to organize. He called the craftsmen. He called the warriors. He did not just ask them to fight. He asked them to integrate their skills. He turned to Goibniu, the smith. "What power can you wield in the battle?" Goibniu answered, Though the men of Ireland continue the battle for 7 years, for every spear that rolls off its shaft or every sword that breaks, I will forge a new weapon in its place. And no spear point which my hand forges shall miss its mark. No skin which it pierces shall taste life again. This is my power." Luke nodded. He turned to Credne the brazier. "And you?" Credne answered, "I will supply the rivets for the spears, the hilts for the swords, and the bosses for the shields. I will make them with such speed that the warriors will never be weaponless." Luke turned to Lukta the right. "And you?" Lukta answered, "I will cut the shields and the spear shafts. I will throw them with such precision that the rivets of Credne and the heads of Goibniu will meet the wood in the air, and the weapon will be whole before it touches the ground." Lug turned to Ogma. "And you, champion?" Ogma's eyes burned. "I will repel the king of the Fomorians. I will match the strength of their greatest warriors. I will hold the line." Lug turned to the Dagda. "And you, All-Father?" The Dagda laughed, a deep, earth-shaking sound. "I will fight for the men of Ireland with a power that will crush the bones of the enemy like hailstones under the feet of a herd of horses. I will wield my club until the dead are piled as high as the ramparts of Tara." Finally, Lug turned to Nuada. Nuada stood among the warriors now, not above them. He looked at the young god who had taken his chair. He felt no resentment, only a profound sense of purpose. He realized that his journey, the loss of the arm, the silver prosthetic, the healing, the abdication, had all been a preparation for this. He was the elder statesman. He was the rock upon which the wave of Lug's brilliance would break. "And you, Nuada?" Lug asked. "What power do you bring?" Nuada drew his sword, the blade that had once been the sword of light, now tempered by the history of his suffering. "I bring the sacrifice," Nuada said softly. "I bring the willingness to die, so that the victory may be won. I will lead the van. I will face the darkness first, so that the light may follow." Lug looked at him with deep respect. "Then we are ready," the Samildanach declared. The Council of War had begun. The 13 days of Lug's reign were a frenzy of preparation. The Tuatha Dé Danann were no longer a collection of depressed, oppressed laborers. They were a machine of war, tuned to perfection by the master of all arts. But outside the walls of Tara, the darkness was gathering. The spies of the Fomorians had returned to Brez. They told him of the new king, the one who shone like the sun. They told him of the preparations. Bress went to Balor. Balor of the evil eye. The giant whose single eye was so heavy with poison and destruction that it took 4 men to lift the eyelid with a hook. "They are preparing," Bress hissed. "They have a new leader, a boy." Balor laughed. It was a dry, cracking sound, like a glacier calving. "A boy," he rumbled. "Then we will crush him, gather the ships, gather the deep-sea monsters. We sail for Ireland. We will tow the island out to sea and sink it. We will extinguish the light of the Tuatha Dé Danann forever." The stage was set. The players were in position. On one side, the Fomorians, the ancient, formless powers of the ocean and the dark. On the other, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods of skill, art, and light, led by the prodigy Lugh, and the restored veteran Nuada. Nuada stood on the ramparts of Tara, looking north. He could smell the sea. He could smell the coming slaughter. He knew, with the foresight of one who has touched the other world, that this would be his final campaign. He would not survive the second battle of Mag Tuired. But as he looked at Lugh, who was teaching the warriors a new formation, Nuada felt peace. The king serves the land. And sometimes, the ultimate service is to bleed into the soil one last time. The feast was over. The game of Fidchel was finished. The real game, the game of blood and destiny, was about to begin. And Nuada, the silver hand, was ready to play his part to the bitter, glorious end. The 13 days of Lugh's interim reign were not measured in hours or sunsets, but in the rhythm of the hammer. The hill of Tara, once a place of feasting and song, had transformed into the anvil of the gods. The air above the fortress shimmered with heat distortion, not from the sun, which was hidden behind the gathering gloom of the Fomorian approach, but from the furnaces of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the three gods of art. Nuada, the restored king who had stepped aside for the savior, walked the ramparts, listening to the industrial symphony of his people, preparing for the end of the world. He walked not as a ruler inspecting his subjects, but as a veteran inspecting his line. He knew the smell of fear. He knew the brittle look in a warrior's eye before the first charge. And he knew that to defeat the Fomorians, the Tuatha Dé Danann needed more than courage. They needed perfection. They needed weapons that did not break, shields that did not shatter, and hearts that did not falter. The center of this preparation was the forge. It was here that the true magic of the Tuatha Dé was revealed. It was not the high magic of spells and incantations, but the deep magic of making. Nuada stood at the entrance to the great smithy, watching the three masters work. It was a dance of impossible coordination. Goibniu, the smith, stood at the forge. He was stripped to the waist, his skin gleaming with sweat and soot, his muscles corded like the roots of an ancient oak. He did not work with the hesitant taps of a mortal smith. He worked with a divine rhythm. Clang, hiss, clang. With one hand, he held the tongs, with the other, the heavy hammer. He would pull a bar of white-hot iron from the coals, strike it 3 times, shape, temper, edge, and it was done. A spearhead, perfect in balance, razor-sharp, thirsty for blood. But a spearhead is useless without a shaft. This was the domain of Lugh, the right. He stood across the workshop, surrounded by a forest of rowan and ash poles. He did not measure. He did not hesitate. He would grab a piece of wood, give it 3 strokes with his adze, shape, smooth, taper, and then, in a feat of dexterity that defied physics, he would throw the shaft across the room. From Goibniu, and the shaft from Lugh, from Goibniu, and the shaft from Lugh crossed paths in the air. Credne would throw the rivets. Ping, ping, ping. The rivets would catch the head, catch the wood, and fuse them together in mid-flight. Nuada watched, mesmerized. The spear would land in a pile, fully formed, still humming with the vibration of its creation. It was a manufacturing line of the divine. No spear point which my hand forges shall miss its mark, Goibniu had promised. Nuada picked one up. It was light, yet it felt heavy with intent. It felt like a living thing, eager to leave the hand. This was the difference between the Tuatha Dé and the Fomorians. The Fomorians fought with the brute force of the wave and the rock. The Tuatha Dé fought with the precision of the needle and the scalpel. But weapons were only half the equation. The soul of the army had to be forged as well. While the smiths worked, the Dagda, the All-Father, the chaotic, earthy counterpoint to Nuada's kingly order, had gone on a journey of his own. He knew that victory required the blessing of the land itself, and the land of Ireland was not a passive soil. It was a woman. It was a goddess. It was the Morrigan. The Dagda traveled south, to the ford of the river Unius in Connaught. It was Samhain Eve, the time when spirits walk. He found her there, the Phantom Queen. She was not in her aspect of the crow or the wolf today. She was a woman of terrifying beauty, straddling the river, washing the bloody armor of the men who were destined to die. The water ran red around her thighs. Nuada was not there to see it, but he felt the reverberation of the meeting. The union of the Dagda and the Morrigan was not a gentle romance. It was a collision of tectonic plates. It was the mating of the mountain and the river. From that union, a promise was born. The Morrigan, satisfied by the vitality of the All-Father, gave him the strategy. She whispered the secrets of the Fomorian movements. She told him where to draw the lines. She promised to take the strength from the kidneys of the enemy, to fill their hearts with the mist of confusion. When the Dagda returned to Tara, he looked different. He looked heavier, more solid. He nodded to Nuada. "The sovereignty is secured," the Dagda said, his voice like grinding stones. "The land will fight with us. The stones will trip them. The rivers will drown them." Nuada accepted this. He was the king of the people, but the Dagda was the king of the earth. They were the two pillars upon which Lug stood. And Lug was everywhere. The Samildanach did not sleep. He was the spark that jumped between the anvil and the hammer. He gathered the sorcerers to the high ridge. He asked them, "What power will you wield?" Mathgan, the sorcerer, answered, "I will shake the 12 mountains of Ireland. I will command them to walk. I will tell the stones of the earth to rise up and fight the Fomorians. Their heads will be crushed by the very ground they stand on." The cupbearers answered, "We will hide the 12 chief lochs of Ireland from the Fomorians. They will find no water. They will drink sand and salt. They will parch in the midst of plenty." The Druids answered, "We will raise a mist of concealment. We will rain fire and blood upon their faces. We will break the morale of their kings." It was a terrifying inventory of magical warfare. Nuada listened to these boasts, and while he was heartened by the power, a cold sliver of dread worked its way into his heart. This was no longer a battle of honor. This was not a duel like the one he had fought with Shreng. This was total war. This was the weaponization of nature itself. The world would be broken to save it. Nuada retreated to his tent. He sat on a simple stool, the silver and flesh hand resting on his knee. He thought of Balor. He had never met the Fomorian king, but he had heard the stories. Balor was the grandfather of Lug, a twisting of the bloodlines that made this war a civil conflict as much as an invasion. Balor's eye was a weapon of mass destruction. When the eyelid was lifted, by 4 servants using hooks and pulleys, the gaze destroyed everything it touched. It withered trees, boiled lakes, and turned armies to ash. How do you fight a look? How do you parry a gaze? Nuada drew his sword. He cleaned the blade, though it was already spotless. He was preparing his mind for the sacrifice. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that he would not be the one to kill Balor. That destiny belonged to the grandson. Nuada's role was to clear the path. His role was to be the bait, the shield, the first line of defense that breaks the momentum of the charge. "I am the Silver Hand," he whispered to the empty tent. "I am the holder. I hold the line. I hold the sovereignty. And when the time comes, I must let go." The day of the gathering arrived. The Fomorian fleet was sighted off the coast. It was not a fleet of ships. It was a floating continent of darkness. Their masts were like a forest of dead trees. Their sails were made of black leather, stitched with the skins of leviathans. They landed at Mag Tuired, the same plain where Nuada had lost his arm years before. It was poetic irony. The cycle was closing. The field that had tasted his blood once would taste it again. The Tuatha Dé Danann marched out to meet them. They did not march in the chaotic tribal clusters of the past. Under Lug's direction, they marched in phalanxes, shield locked to shield, spear point to spear point. They were a glittering wall of gold and silver, a sharp contrast to the chaotic, monstrous horde of the Fomorians. Nuada rode at the front of the van. He wore the armor that Credne had reinforced. He carried the shield that Lukta had cut. He held the sword that Goibnu had tempered. He was the avatar of the Tuatha Dé's industry. Beside him rode Miach, one of the aspects of the Morrigan. Behind him marched the Dagda, dragging his club, which left a furrow in the earth like a plow. They reached the ridge overlooking the plain. The sight that met them would have broken the minds of lesser beings. The Fomorians covered the earth. They were not a uniform race. There were giants with heads like bulls. There were men with the skin of sharks. There were sorcerers wrapped in cloaks of living shadow. And in the center of the host, seated on a moving platform drawn by 12 abominations, sat Balor. He was immense. His head was the size of a boulder. His single eye was closed, the heavy, leathery lid drooping over it like a curtain of doom. The servants stood ready with their hooks, the air around him distorted, as if reality itself was afraid to be near him. Also, there was Indech, the son of the goddess Domnu, the king of the deep Fomorians, and Eletha, the golden-haired prince of darkness, the father of Bress. And Bress himself, looking smaller now, diminished by the company of the monsters he had summoned. The silence fell. It was the silence of the vacuum before the thunderclap. Luke rode up to Nuada. The young god was radiant, his face glowing with the lone lithe, the hero light. He looked at Nuada with eyes that saw all possible futures. "The board is set, King," Luke said. "The pieces are moving. Remember the plan." "I remember," Nuada said. "I take the center. You take the high ground. You wait for the eye." "Do not engage Balor alone," Luke warned. "Wait for me." Nuada smiled. It was a sad, gentle smile. "A king does not wait, Samildanach. A king acts. If I fall, catch the sovereignty before it hits the ground." Lug reached out and clasped Nuada's hand, the flesh hand, the hand of Miach. "It has been an honor to serve you, Nuada Airgetlám." "The honor was mine, Lug Lam Fada." Nuada turned his horse. He raised the sword. He did not scream. He did not boast. He simply spoke one word, a command that carried the weight of the 4 cities of the north, the weight of the exile, the weight of the return. "Advance." The Tuatha Dé Danann surged forward. The Fomorians roared, a sound like the ocean breaking a cliff. The 2 armies collided. The shockwave knocked birds from the sky. The sheer pressure of the bodies buckling against each other caused the ground to ripple. Nuada was in his element. He was no longer the administrator, no longer the diplomat. He was the warrior. He rode into the mass of the Fomorians, cutting a swathe of light through the darkness. His sword was a metronome of death. Left, right, thrust, parry. He fought with a cold, terrifying efficiency. He saw Indech, the Fomorian king, crushing Tuatha Dé warriors with a mace made of whalebone. Nuada turned his horse towards him. This was his duty: to kill the kings, to behead the Hydra. But as he fought, he felt the gaze, not the eye of Balor, not yet, but the weight of destiny. He knew he was fighting on borrowed time. He knew that the silver in his arm was cold, but his heart was burning hot. The forge of the gods had done its work. The weapons held, the shields held. The resurrection cauldron of the Dagda was bubbling behind the lines, ready to receive the dead. But the true test was not of metal, but of spirit. The storm had broken. The gathering was over. Now there was only the slaughter. And Nuada, the bright pilot of the Tuatha Dé Danann, steered his ship directly into the heart of the hurricane, knowing full well that he would not be sailing out the other side. The chaos of the second battle of Mag Tuired was not a confusion of men, but a collision of realities. To the observer standing on the ridge of the Brickleaf Mountains, looking down into the valley of the Unius, it would have appeared as if the earth itself was trying to digest the sky. The Fomorians, creatures of the deep ocean and the dark earth, surged forward like a landslide of black mud and iron. They were led by Indech, the son of the goddess Domnu, a king whose chariot was pulled by beasts that had no names in the tongues of men. Against them stood the Tuatha Dé Danann, a wall of gold, silver, and starlight, holding the line with a precision that bordered on the unnatural. Nuada rode at the center of the storm. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of screaming metal, shattering shields, and the guttural war chants of the giants. But inside the king's helmet, there was a strange, cold clarity. He was the conductor of this orchestra of death. He saw the battlefield not as a brawl, but as a grid of forces. He saw where the Fomorian pressure was greatest. He saw where the Tuatha Dé line was bowing. "Hold!" Nuada roared, his voice amplified by the magic of his helm. "Hold for the light! Let them break themselves against the stone!" He fought with the sword of light, the Claíomh Solais. In the press of the battle, the sword was no longer just a weapon, it was a beacon. Every time Nuada raised it, the blade flared with a blinding white radiance that seared the eyes of the Fomorians, creatures accustomed to the gloom of the abyss. He cut through the ranks of the enemy, his silver and flesh hand gripping the hilt with a strength that was both desperate and divine. He severed the heads of hydras. He shattered the clubs of trolls. He was a whirlwind of sovereign wrath. But the Fomorians were not easily broken. They had numbers. For every giant that fell, 2 more seemed to rise from the mud. They pushed the Tuatha Dé back, step by bloody step. The river Unius began to run red, choked with the bodies of the fallen. Yet, the Tuatha Dé Danann possessed a secret weapon that defied the mathematics of war. Behind the lines, in a grove of rowan trees, lay the Well of Slain. It was a spring of pure magical water, blessed by the incantations of Dian Cecht, his daughter Aermad, and his surviving son Octrialach. Nuada knew the power of the well. He had authorized its use, though it sat uneasily with his sense of honor. It was a weapon of immortality. Whenever a warrior of the Tuatha Dé was slain, cut down by a Fomorian axe or pierced by a dark spear, their comrades would drag the body to the rear. They would cast the corpse into the well. The water would boil and froth, turning a milky white, and then, moments later, the warrior would climb out. Their wounds would be closed. Their strength would be restored. They would pick up their sword and return to the front line, singing. This horrified the Fomorians. They were fighting an enemy that refused to stay dead. They were fighting ghosts who bled, died, and then returned with a smile. Indech, the Fomorian king, saw this cycle of resurrection and knew that he could not win a war of attrition against eternity. He called for a spy. He called for Ruadan, the son of Bress and Brigid, a prince who walked between the 2 worlds. "Go to the rear," Indech commanded. "Find the source of their life. Destroy it." Nuada, busy holding the center against a battalion of shark-skinned berserkers, did not see Ruadan slip through the lines. He did not see the treachery. He was focused on the sheer physical effort of parrying a blow from a giant's mace that would have pulverized a boulder. He felt the shockwave travel down his arm, the arm of Miach, and he marveled that the bone did not shatter. The flesh held. The magic held. But then, a cry went up from the rear. It was not a cry of victory, but of despair. Ruadan had found the well. He had tried to assassinate Goibniu the smith, thrusting a spear through the great artificer. But Goibniu, immortal and enraged, had pulled the spear from his own body and hurled it back, killing the traitor. However, the secret was out. The Fomorians knew. Indech ordered his sorcerers to the river Dros. He ordered them to gather stones, cursed stones, stones from the bottom of the darkest pools. Each Fomorian warrior took a stone. They marched to the Well of Slain. They did not fight the guards. They simply dumped the stones into the spring. 1 by 1, 100 by 100, they filled the well. The cairn rose higher and higher, choking the flow of the healing water. The cairn of Octrialach rose like a tombstone over the hope of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Nuada felt the shift instantly. He felt the death of the well as a sudden coldness in the air. He saw a warrior fall near him, a young spearman named Shermat. The boy went down, his chest crushed. His comrades reached for him to drag him to the well, but they stopped. They looked at the pile of stones in the distance. They realized, with a dawning horror, that there was no coming back. Death had returned to the battlefield. Nuada stopped his horse. He looked around. The immortality was gone. The safety net was cut. Now, every life lost was lost forever. The Tuatha Dé Danann were no longer gods playing at war. They were mortals fighting for survival. "Now!" Nuada screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "Now we fight for the dead who will not rise. Now we fight for the memory. Forward!" He charged. This time, there was no strategy. There was only the need to break the enemy before the despair broke his own army. He rode directly at Indech. The duel between the king of the Tuatha Dé and the king of the Fomorians was a clash of elements. Nuada was air and fire. Indech was earth and water. Nuada struck with the speed of lightning. Indech struck with the weight of a landslide. Nuada's sword carved runes of light into Indech's armor, while Indech's mace dented the silver shield of the High King. They fought until their horses were dead beneath them. They fought on foot, ankle deep in the bloody mud. Nuada was tiring. He was old, in the way that gods are old. He carried the weight of centuries of rule, of loss, of compromise. Indech was primal, inexhaustible. But Nuada had the skill. He feinted low, then struck high. The sword of light caught Indech under the rim of his helm. The Fomorian king staggered. Nuada pressed the advantage, driving him back towards the Fomorian lines. It seemed, for a brief, glorious moment, that Nuada would win, that the king would slay the monster and the war would end. But the battlefield is not a storybook. It is a place of chaos. And in the chaos, a shadow fell over Nuada. A shadow so deep, so cold, that it made the darkness of the Fomorian fleet seem like twilight. The Fomorian ranks parted. They did not scatter in fear. They moved with a reverent, terrified discipline. A platform was wheeled forward. It was drawn by 12 beasts that looked like crossbreeds between oxen and reptiles. The platform was made of black iron, etched with symbols of entropy and decay. On the platform sat Balor. Balor of the evil eye. He was old, ancient. His skin was like the bark of a dead tree, gray and flaking. His body was massive, seated on a throne of bones. But his head was a nightmare. It was huge, dominated by a single massive eyelid that was closed tight. The lid was thick, heavy, scarred by centuries of containing the destructive power within. 4 Fomorian servants stood on the platform, holding iron hooks attached to rings in the eyelid. They waited for the command. Nuada stopped. He stood over the wounded Indech. He looked up at the platform. He knew this moment. He had seen it in his dreams since the day he lost his hand at the first battle. He knew that all his preparations, all his sacrifices, all the silver and the flesh had been leading him to this specific coordinate in space and time. Luch was on the ridge, commanding the slingers. Nuada could see him in the distance, shining like a star. Luch was the future. Luch was the one who could kill Balor, but Luch was too far away. If Balor opened his eye now, he would sweep the entire Tuatha Dé army from the field. He would disintegrate the Dagda. He would erase Ogma. Someone had to draw the fire. Someone had to be the target. Nuada looked at his hand, the hand of Miach. He flexed it one last time. He felt the life in it. "I am the king," he whispered. I am the shield." He abandoned Indak. He turned and walked towards the platform. He walked alone. The battlefield fell silent. The Tuatha Dé Danann watched in horror. They screamed for him to stop, to retreat, to hide. "Nuada!" Macha screamed, running towards him, her red hair flying like a banner of war. She tried to reach him, to pull him back, but the aura of Balor was a physical wall of dread. Nuada did not stop. He raised the sword of light. He began to run. He charged the platform of the god of death. "Balor!" Nuada roared. "Look at me! I am the light of the west! Look at me!" Balor shifted on his throne. He heard the challenge. He felt the presence of the sword of light, a stinging irritation to his dark senses. He grunted a command. "Lift it!" Balor rumbled. "Lift the lid!" The 4 servants hauled on the chains. The pulleys creaked. The massive leathery eyelid began to rise. Nuada ran faster. He was a streak of white fire. He needed to strike before the eye was fully open. He needed to drive the sword into the brain of the monster. He leaped. He soared through the air, the sword of light raised high for a killing blow. But he was a fraction of a second too late. The eye opened. It was not an eye in the biological sense. It was a window into the void. It was a hole in the fabric of reality. The pupil was a chaotic swirl of red and black, a vortex of pure negation. A beam of dark energy erupted from the eye. It did not travel like an arrow. It propagated like a shockwave. It hit Nuada in midair. There was no sound of impact. There was no scream. The sword of light, the greatest weapon of the Tuatha Dé Danann, shattered into 1,000 shards of useless metal. Then the darkness hit the king. Nuada did not burn. He unraveled. The armor of Credne, the silver hand, the flesh hand of Miach, the body that had been healed and broken and healed again. It all simply ceased to be. The atomic bonds that held the god together were negated by the gaze of Balor. For a second, the outline of Nuada hung in the air, a silhouette of white light against the black beam, and then he was gone. Vaporized, erased. The beam continued. It struck Macha, who had been running to save him. She too was caught in the negation. She fell, her life extinguished in an instant. Balor's gaze swept across the ground where Nuada had stood, turning the earth into glass, boiling the blood of the fallen, leaving a scar on the world that would never heal. The servants dropped the lid. The eye closed. Silence returned to Mag Tuired. The Tuatha Dé Danann stood frozen. Their king was dead. Not just dead, but obliterated. The symbol of their sovereignty, the man who had led them from the mists of the north, who had sacrificed his hand and his pride, was gone. Despair, black and suffocating, descended on the army of light. The Fomorians roared in triumph. They surged forward, sensing the collapse. They prepared to butcher the demoralized gods. But on the ridge, the sun did not set. It grew brighter. Luke Lamfada had seen. He had seen the sacrifice of Nuada. He had seen the king draw the fire to save the army. He saw the empty space where his mentor had been. Luke did not weep. He went cold. He reached into his pouch. He pulled out a stone. It was not an ordinary stone. It was a tathlum, a sling stone made by the Druids. It was a mixture of lime, the blood of toads, the blood of bears, and the sand of the Armageddon Sea. It was a stone of hate. Luke placed the stone in his sling. He began to spin it. He stepped off the ridge. He walked down into the valley of death. The Fomorians saw him coming and hesitated. The light radiating from him was blinding. It was not the gentle light of Nuada. It was the searing, angry light of the midday sun. "The king is dead!" Luke shouted, his voice cracking the sky. "Long live the king!" He walked towards Balor. The Fomorian servants, terrified by this new threat, began to haul on the chains again. "Open it!" Balor screamed. "Open the eye! I will erase him too!" The eyelid began to rise. The void began to peek out. But Lug was faster than Nuada. He was the Samildanach. He was the master of the shot. He did not wait for the eye to fully open. He timed his release with the perfection of a god of mathematics. He released the sling. The stone flew. It screamed through the air, breaking the sound barrier. It passed through the closing gap of Balor's eyelid. It struck the pupil. The force of the blow was cataclysmic. The stone didn't just pierce the eye. It drove the eyeball backward. It drove the eye through the back of Balor's skull. The eye, now facing backward, looked out through the shattered rear of Balor's head. It looked directly at the Fomorian army standing behind their king. The beam of destruction erupted one last time, backwards. It hit the Fomorian ranks. It hit Indek. It hit the 12 beasts. It hit the elite guard. In 1 second, the greatest weapon of the Fomorians decimated their own host. A third of the Fomorian army was vaporized by their own king's gaze. Balor fell. The mountain of flesh collapsed, crushing hundreds beneath him. The spell was broken. The Fomorians, seeing their god-king dead and their army destroyed by his own power, broke. They turned and fled. They ran for the sea. They ran for the darkness. The Tuatha Dé Danann, energized by the vengeance of Luke, chased them. The Dagda, Ogma, and the Morrigan led the hunt. They drove the Fomorians into the sea, slaughtering them until the waves turned black with blood. But Luke did not join the chase. He stood alone on the battlefield. He walked to the place where the glass scar marked the earth. He walked to the place where Nuada had stood. There was nothing left. No body to bury. No sword to hang in the hall. Only a faint smell of ozone and the lingering echo of a silver bell. Luch knelt. He touched the scorched earth. "You held the line, Nuada," Lug whispered. "You held it long enough. The battle was won. The Fomorians were broken forever. The Tuatha Dé Danann were the undisputed masters of Ireland. But the age of the silver hand was over. The age of the sun god had begun. And the price of that transition was the ashes of the noblest king who ever sat on the throne of Tara. The sky began to clear. The sun set, painting the battlefield in hues of purple and gold. The crows, the children of the Morrigan, descended to feast. But around the spot where Nuada fell, the ground remained bare. Even the grass, it is said, was too sad to grow there. The war was over. Now there was only the memory, and the weeping of the land for the one who had loved it enough to be unmade for its sake. The silence that fell upon the plain of towers, Mag Tuired, was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of exhaustion. The great engine of war had finally run out of fuel. The Fomorians, those titans of the deep and the dark, had been broken, their remnants fleeing back into the churning gray waters of the Atlantic, never to return as a conquering army. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the children of light and art, stood victorious on the crimson grass, but their light was dimmed. They were no longer the shimmering host that had descended from the northern clouds on burning ships. They were battered, bloodied, and diminished. They had won the island, but they had lost the soul of their kingship. Luch Lamfada, the savior, the master of all arts, stood alone in the center of the battlefield. The sun, which he had summoned to blind the enemy, was now setting, casting long, melancholy shadows across the valley of the Unius. He looked at the scorched scar on the earth where Nuada had stood. There was no body to retrieve. The gaze of Balor had been absolute. It had unmade the king, dissolving bone, flesh, and silver into the fundamental particles of the wind. There would be no cairn for Nuada Airgetlám, for there were no remains to bury. He had become part of the atmosphere of Ireland, a ghost in the very air his people breathed. The Dagda approached, dragging his club, his face streaked with tears and mud. Ogma followed, his shield shattered, his golden skin bruised. They stood with Luch, forming a triangle of power around the empty space. "He is gone," the Dagda rumbled, his voice like the shifting of tectonic plates. "The silver hand is gone." "He is not gone," Luch replied softly. "He has merely changed. He was the vessel. I am the contents. He was the shield. I am the spear. Without the shield, the spear cannot be thrown. We will not mourn him as a failure. We will mourn him as the foundation." They returned to Tara not with the joyous songs of triumph, but with the slow, rhythmic drumbeat of a funeral march. The coronation of Lug was a somber affair. He ascended the Lia File, the stone of destiny. It screamed under his feet, a high, piercing sound of recognition, confirming him as the High King. But as Lug took the white wand of sovereignty, he did not sit on the high seat immediately. He took the silver hand, the artifact itself, the mechanical marvel that Credne had forged and that Nuada had discarded when Miach healed him. Luke placed the silver hand on the highest shelf of the hall, above the shields, above the swords. "This," Luke announced to the assembled host, "is the true crown of Ireland. It is the symbol of the sacrifice. A king who is not willing to cut off his own hand for his people is no king at all. Nuada gave his flesh, and then he gave his life. We shall never forget the silver hand." And so the age of Nuada ended, and the age of Luch began. Under Luch, the arts flourished. The harvest was gathered. The laws were codified. The Fomorians were kept at bay. But the memory of the maimed king, the king who bled for the land, became the deepest root of the Celtic psyche. But the story of Nuada does not end in the mists of Irish mythology. As the centuries turned, as the Tuatha Dé Danann faded into the Sheehy Mounds to become the fairies and spirits of folklore, the archetype of Nuada traveled. It crossed the Irish Sea. It moved into the forests of Britain and the river valleys of Gaul. For Nuada was not just an Irish god. He was a manifestation of a much older, pan-Celtic deity. To understand the depth of Nuada, we must leave the green hills of Tara and travel forward in time and east across the water to the Roman province of Britannia. Here, on the banks of the River Severn, in a place now called Lydney Park in Gloucestershire, we find the final resting place of the Silver Hands legend. Here, archaeologists have uncovered a vast temple complex. It is not a temple to Jupiter or Mars, though the Romans, with their habit of translation, tried to name it so. It is a temple to a god they called Mars Nodens. The name Nodens is the linguistic ancestor of Nuada. In the shifting vowels of the Celtic tongues, Nodens became Nud in Welsh, as in Gwyn ap Nud, the king of the fairies, and Nuada in Irish. The root of the name is debated by scholars of the ancient world. Some say it comes from a root meaning the catcher or the hunter. Others say it means the cloud maker, linking him to the mists of the north from which Nuada descended. But the most compelling interpretation, and the one that links him to the temple at Lydney, is to acquire, or to utilize. The Temple of Nodens was not a place of war, despite the Roman association with Mars. It was a sanatorium. Imagine the scene in the 4th century A.D. The Roman Empire is fading, but the cult of Nodens is vibrant. Pilgrims travel from all over Britain to the temple, overlooking the Severn estuary. They come with broken limbs. They come with failing eyes. They come with the blemishes that would have disqualified a king in Ireland. They come to Nodens because he understands brokenness. They would enter the temple and perform a ritual known as incubation. They would sleep in the holy precinct, hoping that the god would visit them in a dream and tell them how to be healed. They believed that Nodens, the god who had lost his hand and regained it, held the secret of restoration. And what did they leave behind? The earth of Lydney Park has yielded secrets that confirm the myth. Excavators have found hundreds of votive offerings, small statues of bronze. And what do these statues depict? They depict dogs, wolfhounds, hunting dogs, licking their own wounds. In the ancient world, the lick of a dog was thought to be curative. The saliva of the hound was the medicine of the god. This connects Nuada/Nodens to the archetype of the hunter-healer. He is the god who hunts the darkness, like Nuada hunting the Fomorians, but also heals the injury, like Nuada's arm. But even more striking are the other votive offerings found at the site. There are tiny bronze representations of arms and hands. Pilgrims who had lost a hand, or who had a withered limb, would cast a bronze hand and offer it to Nodens, praying for a miracle. They were unknowingly reenacting the story of Credne and Miach. They were offering a metal hand in exchange for a flesh one. The myth of Nuada Airgetlám was not just a story told by bards. It was a living religion practiced by desperate people seeking wholeness. There is a profound melancholy in the ruins of Lydney Park. It sits on a steep bluff, looking out over the gray waters of the Severn, just as Nuada's fort in the west looked out over the Atlantic. It is a liminal space, neither land nor sea, a place where the veil is thin. It was here, in this temple, that a famous cursed tablet was found, a piece of lead inscribed with a plea to Nodens to recover a stolen ring. This tablet, and the Dwarf's Hill nearby, would later inspire a professor of Anglo-Saxon named J.R.R. Tolkien, weaving the legacy of the Silver Hand into the modern mythology of Middle-earth. But the true magic is not in the ring. it is in the hand. Nuada stands as the great tragic hero of Celtic mythology. He is the archetype of the selfless king. In a pantheon filled with tricksters like Lugh, powerhouses like the Dagda, and terrors like the Morrigan, Nuada is the moral center. He is the only god who consistently follows the law, even when the law hurts him. When he lost his arm, he stepped down. He did not cling to power. He did not start a civil war. He obeyed the geis of the blemish. When he was healed, he returned not for revenge, but to save his people from slavery. When the Savior Lugh arrived, he stepped down again. He recognized that his time was done, and he gave the throne to the one who could win the war. And in the end, when the eye of Balor opened, he did not hide behind his army. He walked into the beam. He accepted annihilation. This is why Nuada endures. He represents a truth that is often forgotten in the stories of conquest and glory. That true sovereignty is service. The king is the land, and sometimes the king must die so the land can live. The silver hand is more than a magical prosthetic. It is a symbol of the artificial burdens we carry. We are all blemished in some way. We all carry wounds, physical or spiritual, that make us feel unworthy of our own lives. We all build silver shells to hide our vulnerabilities. We forge defenses of metal and cold logic to protect our stumps. But Nuada's story teaches us that the silver hand is only a temporary fix. The true healing comes from the earth, from the bone to bone, flesh to flesh, connection with our own humanity. And sometimes it comes from the acceptance of our mortality. The fires of the Tuatha Dé Danann have long since burned down. The hill of Tara is covered in grass. The temple of Nodens is a ruin of mossy stones. The Fomorians are just the nightmares of the deep ocean. But if you stand on the western cliffs of Ireland, or on the banks of the river Severn, when the mist rolls in and the sun is hidden behind a veil of gray, you can still feel him. You can feel the presence of the king who waits in the twilight. You can hear the clinking of silver fingers against a bronze hilt. You can feel the ache of a phantom limb. And you can know that as long as there are those who are willing to sacrifice their own wholeness for the good of others, the spirit of Nuada Airgetlám is not dead. He is merely waiting, watching, holding the line between the light and the dark. And so we leave Nuada there, in the quiet dignity of the memory. The king who was unmade, the god who was healed, the silver hand that grasped destiny and refused to let go, even when it burned. Thank you for journeying with me into the mists of the ancient Celtic world. We have walked the path from the northern isles to the battlefield of Mag Tuired, and finally to the quiet temple of the healing dream. If this story of sacrifice, magic, and the deep roots of mythology has moved you, please leave a like and subscribe to Hearths of Myths. Join us next time as we open another dusty tome, stir the embers of the fire, and listen to the whispers of the old gods. Until then, may your hands be strong, may your heart be whole, and may you always find the light in the gathering dark. Sleep well.